I never expected her to look at me that way. The kind of look that strips away years, that makes time irrelevant. She was 45, graceful and certain, and yet, when her eyes lingered on mine, I swear I felt both of us stumble into something that felt dangerously close to falling in love. I hadn't planned on staying long that night. It was one of those small gatherings where you expect nothing more than polite conversation and maybe a drink to pass the time. But the moment I walked into the softly lit room, my eyes caught on her. She wasn't standing in the center, commanding attention like some people do. No, she was off to the side, speaking to a couple of friends, her posture relaxed yet impossibly graceful. There was something about the way she carried herself, confident, yes, but not loud. It was as if she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And maybe that's what drew me in first, the quiet steadiness of a woman who knew herself. Her laughter rose above the hum of the room, not sharp or exaggerated, but warm and textured. It was the kind of sound that made you want to lean closer, just to hear it again. She tilted her head slightly when she laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and I found myself watching longer than I should have. I told myself to look away, to not be obvious. But she had this presence. Even from across the room, I noticed details I usually wouldn't. The way her eyes softened when she listened to someone, the way her hand rested lightly against her wine glass, the way she seemed comfortable in her own silence. She didn't blend in, and yet she didn't demand attention either. It was subtle. It was magnetic. And then she looked back. I wasn't ready for it. Her eyes lifted from her conversation and met mine. Just for a second. Maybe two. But it was enough. My chest tightened, and I felt that strange, unsteady pull you can't quite explain. She didn't smile right away. Her gaze lingered, steady, as though she was quietly assessing me. Then, slowly, her lips curved into a smile, so small I almost questioned whether I imagined it. I glanced away, pretending to focus on something else, but my mind stayed fixed on that moment. When I dared to look back, she was still engaged in her conversation, though a faint trace of that smile lingered on her face. For the rest of the evening, no matter where I moved, I was aware of her. The sound of her voice carried across the room in fragments. The way she leaned in when someone spoke, genuinely listening, made me feel like she gave herself fully to whoever stood in front of her. It wasn't just her beauty, though it was undeniable, shaped not in youth's sharpness, but in the graceful curves and lines that time had etched. It was her presence, her quiet gravity, that unsettled me. I came that night expecting nothing. But as I stood there with a glass in my hand, trying not to be obvious about stealing another glance, I realized something had shifted. It was just one look, one small smile, but it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. I don't know how it happened exactly, whether I drifted toward her or she toward me, but somehow we ended up in the same quiet corner of the room, away from the hum of small talk, the clinking glasses, the background music. It felt almost intentional, though neither of us admitted it. She asked me something simple, something forgettable, maybe how I knew the host. But her voice, low and steady, made the question feel heavier than it was. I answered, stumbling slightly over my words, and she smiled, tilting her head just enough that I felt the urge to keep speaking. The conversation grew from there, not forced, not rushed, just unfolding naturally, layer by layer. She told me about her work, about how she'd fallen in love with traveling years ago, and about the places that still lived in her memory. Paris in spring, the streets of Florence, the bustle of New York. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, her hands moving subtly, painting the air with the places she described. I found myself listening harder than I usually do, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was a richness in her voice, a depth shaped by years and experience, and I felt myself leaning closer, almost unconsciously, to catch every word. When I spoke, it surprised me how much I shared. Normally, I hold things back, but with her I told small truths I rarely spoke aloud. The way I often felt like I was chasing something invisible, the uncertainty of being in my 20s and not having it all figured out. She didn't laugh. She didn't rush to reassure me. She just listened, her eyes steady on mine, like every word mattered. At one point, Our hands brushed on the table between us. Just a graze, her fingertips against the back of my hand as she reached for her glass. But she didn't move right away. Neither did I. It wasn't long, only a few seconds, but in that tiny pause, I felt something pass between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension quietly building. She pulled her hand back slowly, almost reluctantly, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I tried to mask the sudden quickness of my heartbeat, but she caught it. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. The room faded around us. I couldn't have told you what anyone else was saying or doing. All I knew was that every time she laughed, I wanted to be the reason. Every time she leaned in, I wanted her closer. The world outside our corner didn't exist. Not for those lingering minutes that stretched far longer than they should have. And when someone finally called her name from across the room, breaking the spell, she glanced back at me with a look that carried more weight than words ever could. As if to say, this isn't finished. When the gathering began to thin out, I offered, almost without thinking, to walk her home. She hesitated just long enough for me to wonder if I'd overstepped. But then she gave me a soft smile, the kind that didn't need words, and said I'd like that. The night air was cooler than I expected, carrying with it the faint scent of damp pavement and blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. She pulled her scarf a little tighter around her neck, the fabric brushing her cheek, and I found myself wishing I could be the one to shield her from the chill. Instead, I kept my hands in my pockets, fighting the urge to reach out too soon. We walked in step, our strides falling into a natural rhythm, as though our bodies had quietly agreed to match one another. The city was quieter here, the distant hum of cars softened by the hour. Every few steps, our arms brushed. It wasn't deliberate, or maybe it was, I couldn't tell. Each accidental touch left a warmth on my skin that lingered far longer than it should have. Our conversation was lighter this time. Not the deep, searching talks we'd shared earlier, but the kind of easy exchanges that make silence comfortable rather than awkward. She pointed out a small cafe tucked into the corner of the street, and told me it was her favorite spot for Saturday mornings. I told her I'd have to try it sometime, and she gave me a quick glance, lips curved, as though she caught the unspoken invitation in my words. When we passed beneath a street lamp, the glow fell across her face, and I couldn't help but notice details I hadn't before. The faint curve of a smile line at her mouth, the way her eyes held both strength and softness all at once. I thought about how women her age often spoke of wanting to look younger, but standing there, I couldn't imagine wanting her to be any different. She was beautiful exactly as she was. At one point, she stopped walking. Not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet deliberateness. I turned to face her, and for the first time that night, silence filled the space between us. Not the kind that begged to be broken, but the kind that hummed with possibility. She looked at me, steady and unflinching, her lips parting slightly as though words sat just behind them but never made it out. I felt my chest tighten, my heart hammering harder than it should have for such a simple pause. All I wanted in that moment was to step closer, to close the small gap between us. But I held myself still, afraid of moving too fast, afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was forming between us. After a breath, she smiled, small but full of meaning. Then she nodded ahead, as if to say, let's keep walking. And we did. But the quiet that stretched between us after that wasn't the same as before. It was charged, alive, pulsing with everything we hadn't said yet. And I knew. I'd never forget the way she looked at me beneath that street lamp. It was a week later when we found ourselves sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe. She had chosen the spot, a place with wide windows that let in soft afternoon light and shelves lined with books that gave the room an almost lived-in feel. She ordered tea, I ordered coffee, and for a while our conversation meandered as it usually did. But beneath her smile, I sensed something heavier lingering. She held her cup in both hands, staring down at the steam as though it carried answers. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. Sometimes, she began, pausing like she wasn't sure if she should continue, I wonder what people would say about this about us. Her eyes flicked up to mine, then quickly back down to the tea. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup, circling it slowly, like she needed something steady to hold on to. I leaned in slightly. What do you mean? She exhaled, the kind of breath that carries a weight it's been holding too long. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. And me, I'm already 45. I don't want to be some story people whisper about when they see us together. Her words stung, not because of what she said, but because of how much it hurt her to say them. There was a quiet vulnerability in her expression, a hesitancy I hadn't seen before. For all her confidence and grace, she was revealing a part of herself that feared being too much or not enough. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then reached out and placed my hand gently over hers. Her fingers stilled under my touch. I don't care what people think, I said softly. I don't care about whispers or sideways glances. I care about how I feel when I'm with you. Her hand trembled slightly beneath mine, not pulling away, but not completely relaxing either. She finally looked up, and in her eyes, I saw the conflict written clearly. Desire fighting with doubt, hope wrestling with fear. You say that now, she whispered. But what about later? What happens when the novelty wears off? When the difference in years feels heavier than it does today? I didn't have a perfect answer. Maybe there wasn't one. But I tightened my hand over hers, letting the warmth of the touch speak where words failed. I don't know what the future will look like, I admitted, honesty thick in my throat. But I know what I feel tonight, and that's real. For a long moment, she just held my gaze. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something more, but she didn't. Instead, she gave a faint, wistful smile, half acceptance, half resistance. The moment passed, but it left its mark. I could still feel the tremor of her hand beneath mine, the weight of her unspoken fears hanging between us. And yet, I also felt the pull of something stronger, the quiet truth that neither of us could deny, no matter how carefully she tried to guard herself. After that afternoon in the cafe, things began to change. Not all at once, but slowly, in small ways that were hard to ignore. Her texts grew shorter. Where she used to send paragraphs, stories, reflections, late-night thoughts, she now replied with a line or two. Sometimes hours would pass before I heard from her at all. When I suggested meeting again, she would hesitate, not outright saying no, but answering with maybe another time, or this week is complicated. I told myself she was busy, that life had its demands, that work and responsibilities came first. But in my chest, I knew it wasn't just that. She was creating distance. And every time my phone lit up without her name on the screen, I felt the absence of her more sharply than I wanted to admit. I try not to let it show, but it followed me everywhere. At the cafe where we had first sat together, I caught myself staring at the corner table where she had once leaned forward, laughing softly as if the world belonged only to us. Now, the chair sat empty, and the emptiness pressed against me like a weight. Days turned into more than a week. The silence stretched, and I wondered if maybe I had imagined it all, if maybe what I felt had been heavier than what she carried in her heart. Doubt crept in, whispering cruel possibilities, that she regretted the closeness, that she had decided I was too young, that she wanted to spare us both before things went further. And yet, despite the ache of it, I couldn't bring myself to let go. Every time I thought about moving on, I would remember the way her hand had trembled beneath mine, the way her eyes had softened when she confessed her fears. That wasn't nothing. That was real. Then one evening, when I wasn't expecting it, I saw her again. By chance. She was standing outside the very cafe where we'd last spoken, her scarf wrapped around her shoulders, her expression thoughtful, almost heavy. For a moment, I froze, unsure whether to approach or to let her go. But she looked up and saw me before I could decide. Her face shifted instantly, surprised, then something softer, warmer. She smiled. Not the easy, careless smile she wore for strangers, but the one I remembered, the one that reached her eyes and carried both apology and relief. I crossed the street toward her, and in that brief walk, I realized just how much I had missed her, how much the silence had cost me. When I finally stood in front of her, she whispered, almost shyly, "Hi." Just one word, but it unraveled the knot that had been tightening in my chest for days. And in that moment, I understood something. The distance hadn't been about lack of feeling. It had been about too much of it. That night, we walked again. Not by plan, just a natural drift after running into each other, as if the streets themselves conspired to keep us side by side. The air was cooler than before, carrying the faint bite of autumn. The city felt quieter, too, each street lamp spilling golden pools of light onto the pavement, leaving long shadows behind us. We didn't rush. Our steps slowed, matching each other, as if neither of us wanted the night to end too soon. For a while, our words were light. We spoke about books, about a film she wanted to see, about a cafe she still promised to show me. But beneath the surface, something else stirred, an undercurrent we both felt but didn't dare name. Every brush of her arm against mine set sparks moving under my skin. Every silence between us hummed with a tension too thick to ignore. Halfway down the street, she stopped, not abruptly, but in a way that made me stop too, like my body was tethered to hers. She turned toward me, her face half lit by the glow of the lamp overhead. For a moment, she just looked at me, steady, searching, her lips parting slightly as though the words pressed against them were difficult to release. My chest tightened. "What is it?" I asked softly, afraid to breathe too hard and shatter the moment. After that kiss, the world seemed to still. For a moment, there was no city street, no passing cars, no weight of time pressing down on us. Just the two of us beneath the glow of a lonely street lamp. She stayed close, her forehead resting against mine, her hand lingering at my cheek as though she wasn't ready to let go. I could feel her breath, warm and uneven, mixing with mine in the cool night air. My arms slipped around her almost without thought, drawing her gently against me. And when she relaxed into the embrace, her head tipping to rest lightly against my chest, I felt it, the quiet, steady rhythm of her heartbeat, matching the quickened pace of my own. We didn't speak right away. Words would have been too clumsy, too small for the depth of what we just shared. Instead, we let the silence say everything. The hesitation finally broken, the fear softened by something stronger. After a while, she pulled back just enough to look up at me. There was still uncertainty in her eyes, but it was threaded now with something brighter, something that looked a lot like hope. "This is unexpected," she murmured, her voice hushed, as if she didn't want the night to overhear. I smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Unexpected doesn't mean wrong. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, but she shook her head, almost to herself. "I don't know where this goes," she admitted. "I don't have answers." I tightened my hold on her hand, letting my thumb graze across her knuckles. "Neither do I, and maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need the future figured out tonight." Something softened in her expression then, the guardedness slipping just enough for me to see the vulnerability she had been carrying. She leaned back into me, her cheek against my shoulder, and I wrapped my arms more securely around her. For the first time, it felt like she allowed herself to simply be, without explanations, without apologies. We stood there longer than I can measure, content in the quiet closeness. People walked by, a car passed, the world kept moving. But in that space, we stayed still, anchored to each other in a way that felt unshakable. Eventually, she whispered, "I don't want to be afraid of this." I pressed a light kiss to the top of her hair, the gesture gentle, steady. "Then don't be. We'll figure it out together." Her fingers laced with mine, then, deliberately this time, no hesitation. Our hands fit easily, as though they had been waiting for that moment all along. We didn't talk about tomorrow, or the next week, or the years ahead. We didn't need to. All that mattered was the warmth of her hand in mine, the steady weight of her leaning against me, and the quiet certainty that something had begun, something fragile but real, something worth holding on to. And as we finally walked the rest of the way together, side by side, I realized that for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel daunting. It felt possible. Her eyes glimmered, uncertain yet brave. She took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "You make me feel 25 again." The words settled between us like a secret finally set free. My heart stumbled. Before I could respond, she stepped closer. Her hand lifted slowly, almost hesitantly, brushing against my cheek. Her fingertips were cool at first, but the warmth of her skin seeped into me, grounding me in a way nothing else could. I held still, waiting, not wanting to push, not wanting to break the fragile courage she had offered. Then, with a trembling kind of certainty, she leaned in and pressed her lips to mine. It wasn't a hurried kiss. It was soft, lingering, full of meaning. Her lips tasted faintly of the red wine she'd sipped earlier, warm and delicate. I felt her hesitation at first, the careful testing of boundaries, but when I didn't pull away, when I leaned in just enough to meet her halfway, something in her melted. My heart raced, stumbling over itself, but my body felt steady, certain. I lifted my hand to her shoulder, just lightly, grounding us both in the closeness. She let out the faintest breath against my lips, a sound halfway between relief and surrender. When she finally pulled back, she didn't step away. Instead, she rested her forehead against mine, her hand still at my cheek. Our breaths mingled in the cool night air, the silence carrying more weight than any declaration could. And in that charged stillness, I knew, whatever doubts she carried, whatever fears still lingered, this was real. More real than anything I'd felt in years.